Shan was a 22-year-old law student when the then Deputy Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim was sacked and later arrested. These events exploded into the so-called Reformasi movement. But as a law student, his immediate reaction was of cynicism. This was Umno politics, and a continuation of a string of fiascos revolving around the party. The only concern for Shan was the impact these events would have on human rights.
When Anwar was having problem in Umno, we were not that particular and we were not that bothered. And also when he was sacked from Umno, we were not that bothered. Also when the 50 Dalil book came out, we also not that bothered, because everything is within the political framework. But the day Anwar was arrested under the ISA and he was assaulted, that's the time when we decided to look into the matter seriously, because again our concept and our concern is on the rights and freedom.
Coincidentally, 1998 also marked turmoil in Indonesian politics as Mahathir resigned as president and Vice President Habibie took the reins of power. Protesters there also used Reformasi as their slogan, calling for institutional reform, accountability and human rights, which protesters here aped.
The term Reformasi and reformists was something that coined along the way when the movement started growing and certain development happened from Indonesia. So automatically this term was organically developed. So I don't know, until today I look at that particular period of time and I can't solidly say that it was a reform movement or we've been reformists at that particular time. I think we've been a bunch of people who are not happy with the government, who have been doing a lot of actions, a lot of incidences that affected human rights, right from the judiciary, from the Salleh Abbas incidents to the Operation Lalang. So that was very much the concern.
In the early days, there was no clarity in what Reformasi was. It was a protest movement for sure, in which even he participated. It would seem that many were protesting for different reasons. It draws parallels with the current Bersih movement.
To look into this Reformasi phenomena, I think we can take a comparative study between how Reformasi period and how the Reformasi period in comparison to now the Bersih phenomena and this reform under the electoral reform timeline that is we are looking at it now. Right? So at that particular time during Reformasi, again when Anwar was assaulted and he was arrested, and a lot of people took to the streets and they protested against his arrest and his detention as well as his assault. And we as part of the young people who have been very concerned about rights, we also take part in it. But at the same time, we are a bit cautious about what's happening behind the scene and all, and we just take part in it, and it was just a movement of protest, and we've been protesting against his arrest, and then the police react, and then we react back against the police. So it was very much a protest movement, but it was not clear the agenda of Reformasi, or whether it was Reformasi, whether it's really Reformasi, what is the model of Reformasi. Is it like Indonesia? Are we going to topple the government? Are we going to ask for justice for Anwar? Are we going to be asking for investigation? We're not clear. So people from all angles with all concerns came together and put forward a protest. So and then along the line, the Reformasi terminology was introduced and it became popular, and somehow it became attached to the movement. The same thing is happening now with Bersih. I think Bersih, the big demonstrations are happening. People are taking part in the big Bersih demonstrations. And we can look at how people from all angles, with all concerns, with all aspirations, coming forward to protest against one particular issue. But the end product, the agenda is not that clear. I think until today, there's a lot of discussion and debate saying whether Bersih is out to topple the government or they're out to do a reform. Are they just here to serve Anwar personally? So this kind of question exists then as well. So Reformasi period was the beginner, the marker of our political movement, radical political movement. And it continues until today in the same format. So we're also not that clear at that particular time whether are we reformists, are we just protesting against a particular incident and injustice done towards the former Deputy Prime Minister of the country.
But 15 years later, where lies Reformasi now?
I would say that it has died off, a natural death. And because it was not a serious proper agenda put forward by the proponents, and it was organic and it was useful at a particular time. And when Anwar came out of the prison and when the politicians are there to organize back their activities and affairs, this Reformasi terminology movement and also sloganeering have disappeared. Yeah.
Mass movements, whether successful or otherwise, leave impacts on society regardless whether the impact is negative or positive. What impact did Reformasi have on Malaysian society?
For me, as a student, as somebody who was very closely involved in the Reformasi movement at a particular time, we were very much taking part in demonstrations, going for forums, you know, buying cassettes at that particular time of charamas, buying the alternative newspapers, you know, reading the Shikini. So all these were all our life. But what does it bring? For me, at the end of the day, reform was not clear. I think right from the beginning of Reformasi until today, reform agenda was not clear. If you talk about reform, but we don't have a blueprint of reform, we don't have a vision statement, we don't discuss about a debate about vision of the country based on this two-party system that we are proposing for as a way forward. So we're not clear from day one. As well, until today, we also still not clear of the reform agenda. What is the reform agenda? Where are we moving forward as a nation? What is the blueprint or what is the proposal from these two parties, from Barisan Nasional, also Pakatan Rakyat? Where are we heading to as a country? What are the reforms need to be done for that as a country? Because we have the Islamists thinking that they want Malaysia to become Islamic state like Iran, some thinking they want to be Islamic state like Indonesia, some looking at Islamic state like Turkey, and some of the Indians, they talk about Malaysia should become like UK, some looking at America, some looking at India as a model, and some looking at Korea, Japan as a model. So where are we heading to as a country? You know, clearly we know we have a problem. But the last 20 years we're talking about the problem, but where are we going to? What should be the reform? Where are we supposed to be? What is the fundamentals that we need to put? That was not clear from the Reformasi movement. And until today, a lot of us, a lot of activists are still grappling with this term Reformasi and reform, but they're still acting like what we've been acting in the last 20 years, last 15, 20 years. And how we've been reacting during the Reformasi period is continuing. The same format is continuing. But the reform agenda was not brought forward by these grassroots activists who've been involved in these issues for a very long time. And they do not have a collective where they can put forward a blueprint where people, the Malaysian public, can adhere to, understand it, and take part in it. So it's very much a political activity at that particular time that was useful for a particular agenda. That was, in my objective opinion, over the Reformasi period. I think the Reformasi period have managed to create human rights and democracy as a mainstream agenda, as a mainstream idea. And that's what the seed planted at that particular time, that you can see now it have grown into a bigger participatory democracy in Malaysia, where people from all races, from all backgrounds are taking part in demonstrations and protests. So this was very much the value and the contribution of the Reformasi period. I think the Reformasi have made human rights mainstream in Malaysia. And we have now sitting together here openly talking about it, talking about human rights, and we're looking at how Malaysia Kini and other organizations are talking about human rights in such an open manner. This is all the results of the Reformasi period, where we really fought and made sure the human rights agenda become a mainstream agenda for everybody. So that was the contribution of Reformasi for me. And Anwar have successfully delivered on his, on his part, where he managed to break this barrier of human rights as being an elitist political terminology that only affects very few in the urban areas, and now everybody is talking about human rights. I think that was the value brought forward by the Reformasi period.